Victorian England is famous for its strict morals, but behind closed doors, surprising and shocking practices thrived. How did society try to control desire, and what secrets were kept hidden? Stay with us to uncover the dark truths that will change how you see the Victorian era forever. In the heart of Victorian England, a name whispered in parlours and read about in advice columns seemed to have more control over people's private behaviour than any law or monarch. This name belonged to a woman who never truly existed, Mrs. Grundy. She first appeared not in reality but in a stage play written in 1798 by Thomas Morton, Speed the Plough. Although she was never seen on stage, her presence loomed over the characters, influencing their choices with the question, "What would Mrs. Grundy say?" The phrase took on a life of its own, becoming a weapon of social pressure in the real world. By the mid-19th century, Mrs. Grundy had evolved from a fictional busybody into the embodiment of prudish respectability. Her name was invoked in newspapers, sermons, and etiquette manuals, warning people against any action that might be deemed improper. The power of this imaginary figure lay in her ability to represent the invisible judgment of society. People were taught from a young age to imagine her disapproving glance whenever they strayed toward anything deemed indecent, whether it was a daring neckline or a playful flirtation. The true genius of Mrs. Grundy's influence was that it required no physical enforcement. No police officer needed to knock on your door. No official edict had to be posted in the town square. Instead, the fear of gossip, disgrace, and moral condemnation kept people in check. Victorians believed that public shame could destroy not only an individual but an entire family's reputation. This fear meant that even private desires were carefully monitored. Couples often avoided open displays of affection, believing such behavior would tarnish their respectability. It is important to understand that Mrs. Grundy's moral oversight did not stop at the bedroom door. She was invoked in debates about literature, art, and fashion. A novel with a hint of sensuality could be criticized as unfit for respectable women, while a painting that depicted too much skin might be deemed a threat to moral order. The censorship of creative works was often justified by the need to protect society from the imagined scandal Mrs. Grundy might cause. Her power also extended into social mobility. A woman hoping to marry well had to appear chaste, modest, and untainted by rumors. A man's public conduct was also scrutinized, though his private indiscretions were more likely to be overlooked. This double standard was one of the most enduring injustices of the time. Yet the fiction of Mrs. Grundy allowed the upper classes to maintain a facade of moral superiority while quietly tolerating their own excesses behind closed doors. Interestingly, while the name became a symbol of moral restraint in Britain, it spread far beyond English borders. In colonial societies where British settlers imposed their values on local cultures, Mrs. Grundy's ghost travelled with them. In parts of India, Canada, and Australia, the term became shorthand for the imported morality of the British Empire. Even those who rejected Victorian prudishness knew the phrase, often using it ironically to mock hypocritical behaviour. Historians now view Mrs. Grundy as a psychological tool. She was not just about sexual restraint, but about preserving a rigid social hierarchy. By making people constantly aware of potential judgment, she reinforced class divisions and gender roles. Women in particular bore the weight of her imagined gaze. An unmarried woman who was seen walking alone with a man could be the subject of endless speculation, no matter how innocent the encounter. The fear of Mrs. Grundy was so ingrained that even when social attitudes began to loosen in the late 19th century, her shadow lingered. The rise of more permissive attitudes in the 1890s did not fully erase her hold over people's minds. Private diaries from the time reveal that individuals often scolded themselves for feelings or actions they thought Mrs. Grundy would not approve of, even when no one else knew about them. One of the most fascinating aspects of this moral phantom was that she allowed the Victorian public to avoid direct confrontation. Instead of openly condemning someone, people could simply invoke her name, and the message was clear. It was a way of policing behavior without taking personal responsibility for the judgment. In this sense, Mrs. Grundy was the polite face of social control, smiling in public, but whispering cruelly in private. Today, Mrs. Grundy survives mostly as a historical curiosity, a reminder of how societies can invent symbols to regulate behavior. But in her time, she was a force to be reckoned with. Through her, Victorians learned to guard their words, hide their emotions, and mask their desires. The real tragedy is that countless people lived their lives according to the approval of someone who was never real at all. Yet, as much as Mrs. Grundy kept people in line through imagined shame, there were those in the Victorian era who took their moral policing to physical extremes. Instead of relying on the power of rumour, they used cold, unforgiving devices to control the body itself. Stay with us to uncover the shocking contraptions that turned desire into pain in the next chapter. Let us tell you. The Jugum penis and other male chastity devices. In a society obsessed with controlling human desire, it was not enough for Victorians to preach moral restraint. For some, words and warnings were too weak to curb temptation. They turned instead to physical devices, intricate in design, yet merciless in function, to keep men from succumbing to their own urges. Among these, one of the most notorious was the Jugum penis, a contraption so uncomfortable that even the thought of it could make a man wince. The Jugum penis looked deceptively simple, a metal ring fitted with inward-facing teeth. It was worn at night, when the body's natural rhythms might stir without conscious thought. If an erection began, the teeth would dig into sensitive flesh, producing immediate pain and waking the wearer. This sudden discomfort was intended to condition men into avoiding both conscious and unconscious arousal. It was the Victorian answer to what moralists called nocturnal emissions and self-abuse. But the Jugum penis was not the only invention to wage war on male desire. Medical supply catalogues from the era advertised a variety of anti-masturbation belts, some made of leather, others of steel, all equipped with locks. These belts were worn tightly around the waist, with a protective shield covering the genital area. Parents of adolescent boys were sometimes persuaded by doctors or moral reformers to use such devices, believing that unchecked desire could lead to insanity, blindness, or even early death. The reasoning behind these contraptions reveals much about the Victorian mindset. Sex was seen primarily as a duty for procreation, not as a source of pleasure. Any activity that sought to separate pleasure from reproduction was considered dangerous. Medical journals published alarming claims that excessive self-indulgence weakened the mind, sapped the body's vitality, and reduced a man's ability to work productively. In an age when physical and moral discipline were seen as intertwined, controlling one's urges was framed as an essential part of being a respectable man. Even some religious leaders endorsed such devices, claiming they were a godly solution to sinful temptation. It was not uncommon for a minister to recommend a chastity belt to a struggling parishioner, describing it as a way to protect the soul from eternal damnation. The blending of spiritual fear and medical warning created a powerful cultural force, making resistance to these practices rare, especially among the devout. Manufacturers of the time marketed these devices as scientific and hygienic, presenting them in respectable advertisements alongside other medical instruments. The language was clinical, but the intention was moral. Illustrations of the devices appeared in some health manuals, though always accompanied by lengthy justifications for their necessity. The tone was never about cruelty, it was about preserving purity and restoring self-control. While it is easy to dismiss these measures as extreme, it is important to understand that they were part of a broader movement in the 19th century toward mechanizing morality. Victorians believed that discipline could be engineered into the body. If the mind could not always be trusted to resist temptation, then the body itself had to be made a deterrent. The Jugum penis and its counterparts were the embodiment of this philosophy. Of course, not all men submitted willingly. Some found ways to pick the locks or remove the devices without detection. Others endured the discomfort but harbored deep resentment toward the moral authorities who had convinced their families to impose such measures. Rare letters and diary entries from the period hint at the humiliation and frustration felt by those subjected to these devices, though such admissions were dangerous to make publicly. Interestingly, Similar devices were occasionally adapted for women, though their designs differed due to anatomy. These female chastity belts, often lined with metal or leather plates, were used in certain reform schools and asylums where administrators sought to eliminate any hint of sexual activity. While the male devices aimed to prevent arousal, the female versions sought to block physical access entirely. What is perhaps most remarkable is that these instruments were not considered fringe inventions. They were sold by reputable suppliers and endorsed by segments of the medical community. Some were even patented, their designs officially recorded as legitimate tools for health and moral improvement. This official recognition reinforced the belief that desire itself was a kind of disease that required mechanical treatment. By the turn of the 20th century, medical opinion began to shift. Advances in psychology and sexual science challenged the idea that self-pleasure caused mental illness or physical decline. Devices like the jugum penis slowly disappeared from mainstream medical catalogues, though they remained a haunting reminder of how far society would go to suppress human nature. The Victorian war on male desire was not limited to the use of metal and leather. Beyond these physical instruments, the era's moralists also imposed elaborate rules on how married couples could touch, kiss, and share a bed. If the jugum penis was the blunt weapon of physical restraint, these social codes were the delicate web of psychological control that kept intimacy locked away from genuine affection. What if a single kiss could be considered the first step toward ruin? Let us tell you. When kisses were dangerous. In the Victorian world, intimacy was treated with suspicion, and nowhere was this more evident than in the way couples were instructed to kiss, or rather, to avoid kissing. The act itself, so natural in human connection, was considered potentially corrupting if done outside the strict boundaries of procreation. Even within marriage, certain types of kisses were discouraged, and some advice was so extreme that it reads like satire today. One of the most revealing sources of these rules comes from the 1894 publication Sex Tips for Husbands and Wives by Ruth Smithers. Far from being a guide to romantic connection, it was a manual for maintaining emotional distance under the guise of morality. Smithers advised women that if a husband attempted to kiss them on the lips, they should turn their head so the kiss would land harmlessly on the cheek. The reasoning was clear. Direct mouth-to-mouth contact was seen as overly stimulating and could lead to improper passions. Her guidance went further. If a husband's hands wandered or his affection became too insistent, the wife was instructed to spring from the bed and announce she needed the bathroom. This abrupt physical and verbal interruption was meant to extinguish desire immediately. For Smithers and those who shared her beliefs, physical closeness was a slippery slope that could lead to indulgence beyond the sacred duty of reproduction. The roots of this suspicion toward kissing ran deep. Victorian society was steeped in a belief that physical pleasure for its own sake was morally dangerous. In the eyes of many moralists, even married couples were at risk of losing their virtue if they engaged in affection that did not directly lead to procreation. Kissing on the lips, especially prolonged kissing, was seen as a gateway to reckless passion. It blurred the line between what was necessary for marriage and what was considered sinful indulgence. Etiquette manuals from the time echoed these warnings, often describing romantic kissing as something foreign, associated with looser continental cultures like France or Italy. A respectable Englishman or Englishwoman, they argued, should maintain composure and not be ruled by impulse. This extended to public behavior as well. A kiss on the cheek in public might be tolerated in certain formal situations, but anything beyond that risked whispers of impropriety. What makes these restrictions even more curious is that the Victorian era also produced some of the most passionate love letters in history. While public and physical displays were tightly controlled, written words could carry deep emotional and sensual meaning. Lovers often poured their desires into carefully coded language, knowing that to express them openly in person would invite suspicion. In this way, kissing in the flesh was replaced by kissing in ink. Desire transferred to the page, where it could be hidden from the watchful eyes of Mrs. Grundy. It was not only wives who were warned against passionate kissing. Men were told that giving in to such temptations could cloud their judgment and distract them from work and moral duty. A husband who sought physical affection too often was seen as weak-willed, lacking the discipline expected of a Victorian gentleman. This pressure created a strange paradox. Love and marriage were celebrated, but genuine intimacy within them was often viewed as a problem to be solved rather than a bond to be nurtured. Some households developed unspoken rules about kissing that went beyond Smithers' explicit advice. Certain couples kept separate bedrooms, meeting only when the practical purpose of intimacy was required. In such homes, affection was reserved for special occasions, and even then, it was restrained and brief. This atmosphere of caution made true romantic spontaneity rare, and many couples grew used to relationships defined by polite companionship rather than deep physical connection. While these customs might seem alien now, they were part of a larger system designed to limit sexual expression in all its forms. Just as the jugum penis was intended to physically prevent men from acting on desire, rules against passionate kissing were meant to psychologically suppress both partners. In this way, the body and the mind were equally disciplined, each reinforcing the other in service to Victorian ideals of purity. Yet, despite the strictness of these rules, human nature often found ways around them. Some couples, deeply in love, ignored the advice entirely behind closed doors. Others became skilled at disguising intimacy as innocent affection, sharing quick touches or glances that conveyed more than words ever could. These private rebellions remind us that while Victorian society tried to control the body, the human heart often resisted such boundaries. The policing of kissing was not the end of the story. It was only one element of a broader fear that personal pleasure could unravel both moral character and physical health. This fear was most intensely focused on acts that were done in solitude, far from the watchful eyes of others. But what if a harmless private habit was believed to drain the mind, ruin the body, and invite madness? Stay with us to uncover the secret war against self-pleasure, the silent shame of self-pleasure. They called it self-abuse, solitary vice, and the secret habit. It was the kind of subject that could halt conversation mid-sentence and turn eyes toward the floor. In Victorian England, it was not simply frowned upon, it was feared. The whispers were always the same. It could sap the mind, waste the body, and lead a person down a path of sickness, insanity, or worse. Moral reformers and doctors spoke with the same certainty as if they were describing a fatal disease. Health manuals claimed the act could cause blindness, epilepsy, memory loss, even a permanent decline of intellect. Lists of supposed warning signs were circulated: paleness, nervousness, an abnormally thin frame, or in other cases, suspicious softness and plumpness. The contradictions did not matter. What mattered was the conviction that the act was dangerous. One name rose above all in this crusade: Samuel Auguste Tissot. Although he wrote decades before the Victorian period, his theories were embraced with fresh fervor. He warned that the loss of vital fluid would weaken the entire system, eroding both mental clarity and physical health. His words became gospel, repeated in lectures at schools and printed in pamphlets handed out to parents determined to protect their children. The response was vigilance. Boarding schools, especially those for boys, created elaborate systems to prevent any moment of privacy at night. Beds were arranged far apart, blankets were cut short, and surprise inspections were common. Teachers or prefects might carry lanterns through the dormitory in the small hours, shining light directly onto sleeping faces. For those suspected of indulging, physical deterrents were introduced. The cruel jugum penis, locked leather belts, and metal rings fitted with spikes were marketed as solutions. Girls, too, were sometimes subjected to mechanical safeguards, metal plates or shields designed to block access entirely. These instruments were not presented as punishment, but as acts of care, a way to save someone from a future of ruin. The fear was not limited to the young. Adults, even within marriage, were warned against selfish pleasure. Writers like Ruth Smithers advised wives to keep intimacy rare, measured, and purposeful, only for conception. If a husband sought contact more often, the advice was simple: reduce it gradually, using excuses of headaches or sudden needs to leave the bed. Pleasure without the prospect of children was framed as wasteful, weakening both body and morality. Any indulgence was thought to drain vital energy, leaving individuals physically depleted and morally compromised. Victorians linked self-pleasure with idleness. A man who devoted himself to it was seen as neglecting his duties to society, his character slipping away with every secret act. A woman risked her reputation, her imagined purity tainted by the mere suspicion of the habit. In this way, sexual restraint became not only a moral expectation but a civic responsibility, intertwined with the very fabric of Victorian social order. The campaign even extended to the dinner table. Certain foods, mustard, pepper, rich sauces, chocolate, ripe fruits, were believed to awaken dangerous desires. Alcohol and tobacco were accused of the same crime, considered stimulants of the senses that could ignite forbidden passions. In schools, meals were kept deliberately plain, in the belief that a bland diet would keep thoughts pure and bodies disciplined. This intricate control over diet and behavior reflected the Victorian obsession with mastering not just actions, but the very impulses within. Some families, alarmed by rumors or behavior, turned to doctors for treatment. Cold baths, vigorous exercise, and in extreme cases minor surgical procedures were prescribed to make the act physically more difficult. These measures were justified as medicine, though in truth they were steeped in moral panic. There were dissenting voices. A handful of physicians quietly acknowledged that the health warnings were overblown. A few reformers even argued that the real harm came from the guilt and anxiety instilled in the young. But to challenge the prevailing view was to risk professional ruin, so most remained silent. By the time the century turned, scientific thought had begun to shift, but the shadow of Victorian morality was long. Even as evidence grew that the act was harmless, the shame it carried clung to public opinion. Generations inherited the guilt, proof that fear, once planted, can outlast the facts. The campaign against solitary pleasure was never only about the act itself. It was also about controlling sexuality, reproduction, and the social consequences of intimacy outside marriage. And when a child was born without a wedding ring to sanction their existence, the moral judgment could be swift and merciless. What happened to women who bore such children in an unforgiving society? The truth reveals a cruelty far greater than whispers in the night. Let us tell you, illegitimacy and the fate of unwed mothers. What price would a woman pay for a child born without a wedding ring? In Victorian England, the social and legal consequences for women who gave birth outside marriage were devastating. The stigma surrounding illegitimacy was so severe that an unwed mother's very existence could be cast into disgrace, with repercussions not only for her, but also for her child. This chapter delves into the harsh realities faced by these women, the abandonment of infants, and the heartbreaking tragedies that followed. Victorian society was obsessed with maintaining the image of moral purity. Any child born out of wedlock was branded illegitimate, a label that meant lifelong discrimination. These children were often denied inheritance rights, social acceptance, and basic respect. Their mothers, frequently young and vulnerable, were shunned by family and community alike. The burden of shame fell heavily on them, forcing many into isolation or desperate decisions. In many cases, families forced pregnant daughters into secretive confinements known as lying-in homes or Magdalene asylums, institutions where women were made to give birth far from the public eye. These places were harsh and unforgiving, combining religious repentance with strict control over women's bodies and minds. Women rarely left these homes with their babies, as the children were frequently sent away to orphanages or tragically abandoned altogether. The phenomenon of infant abandonment was tragically common. Public foundling wheels allowed mothers to leave newborns anonymously at certain hospitals or churches, hoping the child might survive better than if kept in shameful secrecy. However, survival rates were grim. Many infants left in this way succumbed to neglect, illness, or malnutrition. Victorian charities and reformers struggled to cope with the sheer number of abandoned babies, some of whom were later adopted or fostered, but many never escaped the harshness of their early years. A particularly tragic consequence of this stigma was infanticide. Though shocking to modern sensibilities, killing a newborn was sometimes seen as a desperate act by mothers who faced starvation, homelessness, and complete social rejection. Courts often treated infanticide cases with some degree of leniency compared to other forms of murder, recognizing the overwhelming social pressures that led women to such extremes. The infamous infanticide defense became a legal and moral battleground, revealing the darker side of Victorian values. The law itself was unsympathetic. Fathers of illegitimate children faced little responsibility, leaving mothers to bear the burden alone. Financial support was rare and difficult to enforce. In some cases, women were forced into prostitution or exploitative labor just to survive, further perpetuating the cycle of condemnation. Interestingly, there were also cultural contradictions. Popular literature and sensational newspapers frequently depicted fallen women with a mixture of moral outrage and lurid fascination. These stories sometimes offered cautionary tales but also gave a glimpse into the hidden struggles behind Victorian decorum. Women who bore children out of wedlock could find themselves caricatured as immoral or sinful, but at times they were also subjects of sympathy or even heroism in fighting against harsh social judgments. The unyielding stigma shaped how illegitimacy was viewed for generations. It was a mark that could follow a child into adulthood, affecting marriage prospects, employment opportunities, and social standing. Many illegitimate children were given false identities or hidden away to protect family reputations. The echoes of this treatment linger in social attitudes long after the Victorian era ended. Yet, amidst this bleakness, some women managed remarkable acts of resilience. Secret midwives, female-run shelters, and underground networks provided aid and shelter for those cast aside. The seeds of early feminist movements were sown in these acts of defiance against rigid societal norms. As harsh as these realities were, they reveal much about the Victorian obsession with control over bodies, families, and the very definition of respectability. The fate of unwed mothers was a harsh lesson in how society could simultaneously idealize womanhood while mercilessly punishing its deviations. What made a woman's hard-earned money more dangerous than her secret shame? Stay with us to know. The fallen woman and the threat of prostitution. A woman earning her own living was often met with suspicion and fear, especially if that income came from outside traditional domestic roles. The figure of the fallen woman emerged as a powerful symbol of social anxiety, a warning of what could happen when a woman stepped beyond the strict boundaries imposed by society. Prostitution, in particular, was seen as the ultimate sign of female transgression and independence, creating a complex mix of condemnation and fascination. Respectability hinged on a woman's purity, and the ideal Victorian woman was devoted entirely to home and family. Yet, economic realities forced countless women into the workforce, where low pay and grueling hours were common. Jobs like domestic service or factory work rarely offered a path to financial security. For many, prostitution was not a choice, but a desperate means of survival. Despite its widespread existence, prostitution was cloaked in secrecy and shame. Brothels and streetwalkers filled cities, but official discourse branded the trade as a moral blight. The fallen woman became a feared figure, embodying the threat that female independence posed to traditional gender roles. Her presence unsettled the social order, raising questions about control, power, and morality. The label "fallen" carried a heavy weight. It marked a woman as having lost her virtue and social status, often leading to isolation and rejection from family and community. Many women who fell into prostitution had been victims of betrayal, poverty, or abuse, rather than willful sinners. Still, society showed little compassion, preferring to blame the individual rather than the harsh conditions that forced such choices. Religious and charitable organizations responded by establishing refuges and reformatories for fallen women. These institutions aimed to rescue and rehabilitate women through strict discipline, religious instruction, and training in domestic skills. While often harsh, these places sometimes offered the only hope for women to escape destitution and rebuild their lives. Economic independence, even when earned through prostitution, was deeply unsettling to Victorian society. Women who could earn their own money challenged male authority and traditional family structures. The very act of surviving on one's own terms was threatening, and prostitution became a symbol of female autonomy that many found dangerous. The social debate around prostitution was intense. Campaigners pushed for legal reforms to control or abolish the trade, while others called attention to poverty and social inequality as root causes. The Contagious Diseases Acts, which allowed forced medical exams of suspected prostitutes, revealed glaring gender biases. Women's bodies were policed and controlled, while their clients faced little scrutiny. Popular culture fed both the fear and fascination with fallen women. Literature, theatre, and art portrayed tragic stories of women who lost their way, but sometimes found redemption. These narratives reflected society's conflicted feelings, condemnation mixed with sympathy, horror mixed with desire. Prostitution was not simply a story of victimhood. Some women wielded the trade as a form of resistance, gaining financial control and social networks beyond the family. This complexity challenged the era's rigid ideals and exposed deep anxieties about gender and class. Enforcement of prostitution laws was uneven and often corrupt. Women faced harsh punishments, while brothel owners profited. Many prostitutes suffered abuse from authorities, highlighting the brutal realities behind the moral rhetoric. What strange Victorian beliefs linked common foods to sinful desires? Let us tell you, the foods that could make you lustful. Food in Victorian England wasn't just fuel for the body, it was a battleground for the soul. Certain ingredients carried a secret danger, believed to spark hidden desires and loosen the tight reins of self-control. A simple taste of mustard or a quiet sip of cider could be enough to set the mind wandering into forbidden territory. This strange fear shows just how obsessed Victorian society was with policing even the smallest sparks of temptation. Victorian society held a deep conviction that what one ate was inseparable from one's character and moral standing. Diet was viewed not merely as a source of physical nourishment, but as a vital factor shaping temperament, health, and most importantly, virtue. This belief was rooted in the ancient medical theory of bodily humours, fluids within the body thought to govern emotions and personality. According to this theory, an excess or imbalance of certain humours could lead to undesirable behaviours, including lustful thoughts and moral weakness. Spicy and rich foods, especially, were suspected of stirring passions that could overwhelm a person's willpower and self-restraint. Among these suspect foods, mustard occupied a notorious place. Considered a fiery stimulant, mustard was believed to set the blood aflame. There was even a popular saying warning that a mere pinch of mustard could transform a demure, modest woman into someone vulnerable to sinful temptations. The heat of mustard was seen as a direct metaphor for the heat of desire, making it a forbidden spice for young women trying to maintain their purity. Similarly, cider, an otherwise common and innocuous drink, was thought to have the power to loosen inhibitions and encourage wantonness. Such beliefs, strange as they seem now, were widespread and taken seriously. But the list of dangerous foods extended far beyond mustard and cider. Onions and garlic, staples of many diets today, were feared for their ability to inflame the senses. Rich meats and heavily spiced dishes were also avoided by those wishing to maintain strict moral discipline. Some Victorian doctors went as far as to advise complete abstention from so-called aphrodisiacs like oysters, warning that these delicacies could awaken uncontrollable sexual urges. Women, in particular, were subject to rigorous dietary restrictions. Their meals were carefully curated to suppress any hint of sexual appetite, with the goal of preserving their reputation for chastity and moral virtue. These dietary fears were not confined to whispered warnings at the dinner table. They found their way into cookbooks and medical guides of the era. These publications often included stern cautions against certain ingredients, especially for young women. Recipes were deliberately bland and simple, designed to promote physical health while preventing any kind of moral corruption. Mothers were urged to monitor their daughters' eating habits closely, shielding them from foods thought to be capable of awakening dangerous desires. This intersection of nutrition and morality reveals just how pervasive the Victorian obsession with controlling female sexuality truly was. Interestingly, these strict dietary rules also mirrored the class divisions of the time. Wealthier Victorians had access to a wider variety of exotic and richer foods. They were expected to demonstrate extraordinary self-discipline in resisting temptation, embodying ideals of refined restraint and moral superiority. Meanwhile, working-class diets were often sparse out of sheer necessity, lacking many of the banned rich ingredients. However, the cultural anxieties about food and desire did not discriminate by class. Even poorer women internalized these fears, reflecting how deeply Victorian society's moral codes had permeated every level. The strange, sometimes bizarre connection between diet and morality provides a revealing glimpse into the broader Victorian struggle for control. Control not only over behavior but over bodies and minds in every conceivable way. Food became a battlefield where purity was defended fiercely, and a single misstep could threaten a woman's social standing or even her future. What was consumed was seen as a sign of character, a reflection of inner virtue or vice. In this way, the simple act of eating became charged with meaning far beyond nutrition. Food was linked to temptation and sin, self-control and downfall. It was another tool by which Victorian society sought to police female sexuality and maintain rigid boundaries around acceptable behavior. The consequences of these beliefs were both practical and psychological. Women lived under constant scrutiny, aware that what they ate might reveal their moral character or provoke gossip. Dietary restrictions also intensified anxieties around natural bodily desires, contributing to a culture that denied women full knowledge and ownership of their own sexuality. As peculiar as these food taboos seem now, they were part of a larger framework of Victorian ideals and fears, a framework that extended into marriage, childbirth, and even the laws governing women's bodies. Stay here, we uncover the bizarre birth control myths that Victorian couples trusted, including some that seem unbelievable today. Misguided birth control myths. Victorian England's obsession with controlling sex extended far beyond public morality. It penetrated the private lives of couples who sought to avoid pregnancy through methods that often defy logic today. Despite limited scientific knowledge and rigid social taboos surrounding discussions of sex, countless myths and superstitions about birth control circulated widely. These bizarre practices reveal just how desperate people were to manage reproduction in an era that left them little real agency over their own bodies. Contraception as we understand it today was largely unavailable or socially unacceptable in Victorian times. The prevailing view held that sex was primarily for reproduction, and any attempt to interfere with this natural purpose was frowned upon or deemed immoral. However, economic hardship, health concerns, and personal choice led many couples to seek out methods to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Since medical science had not yet developed reliable birth control, folklore and hearsay filled the void. One of the most widely believed myths was that dancing or vigorous physical activity immediately after sex could prevent conception. Couples were told that shaking the body would somehow dislodge the seed before it could take root. This notion was passed down through whispered advice and popular guides, despite having no basis in biology. Women were encouraged to jump, spin, or even ride horses after intercourse, believing these movements could magically ward off pregnancy. Horse riding itself was considered a peculiar form of birth control. For upper-class women who had access to leisure activities, a horseback ride after intimacy was thought to shake the seed loose. This belief reflected both a lack of understanding about human reproduction and the Victorian tendency to cloak taboo subjects in euphemism and folklore. Other strange customs included washing the body with various herbs or concoctions after sex. Some believed that douching with vinegar or herbal infusions could cleanse the womb and prevent conception. Medical advice books often recommended these remedies, though their effectiveness was, at best, unproven and sometimes harmful. The use of tight-laced corsets was also linked to birth control myths. It was believed that wearing a corset tightly could suppress fertility by constricting the womb or impeding conception. While corsetry was primarily a fashion statement tied to Victorian ideals of femininity, some women embraced the idea that it might help control their reproductive fate. Perhaps most striking was the persistence of superstition in matters of conception. Various charms, amulets, and rituals were employed to either encourage or prevent pregnancy. Women might carry talismans or recite certain prayers, reflecting a belief that mystical forces could influence the delicate process of human reproduction. These myths often arose from a desperate need to assert control in a society where women's bodies were tightly regulated by men, law, and religion. Actual knowledge about conception was limited, sexual education was almost non-existent, and open conversation about family planning was taboo. In this vacuum, folklore filled the gaps, providing hope and a sense of agency, however illusory. The consequences of relying on such misguided beliefs could be severe. Unplanned pregnancies were common, and many women faced dire choices. Abortion was illegal and dangerous, while social stigma against illegitimacy was crushing. Many couples lived in constant fear, grasping at any method that promised relief from the relentless pressure to produce children. Despite the risks, some early advocates began to challenge these myths, promoting more practical approaches to birth control, though these ideas remained fringe and often underground. The journey toward reproductive rights would be slow and fraught with resistance, but the Victorian myths mark a crucial chapter in the history of human sexuality. Understanding these strange birth control practices reveals the lengths to which people would go to negotiate the demands of society, biology, and personal desire in a time of rigid control and limited knowledge. It also sheds light on the deep fears and misunderstandings surrounding female sexuality that persisted for generations. Could a strange dance or a horse ride really decide a family's fate? Stay with us to discover these unbelievable Victorian birth control myths. Policing women's bodies, the Contagious Diseases Acts. During the late Victorian era, the British government enacted a series of controversial laws, collectively known as the Contagious Diseases Acts. Ostensibly introduced to protect the health of military personnel, these acts empowered the police to arrest women suspected of prostitution and subject them to compulsory medical examinations. This legislation institutionalized the invasive policing of women's bodies, reflecting a stark gender bias and exposing deep societal fears around sexuality, morality, and public health. The Contagious Diseases Acts first appeared in the 1860s, a time when venereal diseases such as syphilis and gonorrhea were widespread and posed serious risks, especially to soldiers and sailors stationed in garrison towns and ports. Authorities feared that untreated infections among women engaged in sex work were fueling the epidemic, undermining the effectiveness of the British military. Consequently, Parliament passed laws to control and regulate prostitution, focusing almost exclusively on women while largely ignoring the role of male clients in the spread of disease. Under these laws, police officers were granted sweeping powers to arrest any woman they suspected of being a prostitute within designated contagious disease districts. Once detained, these women faced forced medical examinations to determine whether they carried sexually transmitted infections. The examinations were highly invasive, involving physical inspections without the woman's consent. If infection was confirmed, the women were often confined to lock hospitals, institutions designed to isolate and cure them before releasing them back into society. This cycle of suspicion, examination, and imprisonment could repeat indefinitely, as many women were subjected to these procedures multiple times. The criteria used to determine suspicion were alarmingly vague and subjective. Women could be targeted simply based on their appearance, where they lived, or association with men considered questionable by the police. Working-class women who lived near military barracks or frequented certain areas became prime targets. This vague definition gave police the authority to detain and examine women without substantial evidence, resulting in widespread abuses and harassment. The impact on women's lives was devastating. These examinations were not only physically painful, but also emotionally humiliating and degrading. Women had no legal protections or recourse against police brutality or wrongful detention. The stigma attached to being labeled a prostitute by the authorities could destroy reputations, limit employment opportunities, and fracture family ties. Many women found themselves trapped in a cycle of surveillance and incarceration simply for living in poverty or associating with the wrong people. Public outrage against the Contagious Diseases Acts grew steadily, fueled by testimonies from affected women and activist groups. The acts became a focal point for early feminist activism. Josephine Butler, a formidable campaigner for women's rights and social reform, spearheaded efforts to repeal the legislation. She argued passionately that the laws violated the civil liberties of women, perpetuated discrimination, and failed to address the root causes of prostitution, such as poverty and lack of education. Butler and her supporters highlighted the double standards embedded in Victorian society. While women were subjected to invasive policing and harsh punishment, the men who solicited sex were rarely held accountable. This blatant gender inequality revealed a social order determined to control female sexuality while excusing or ignoring male behavior. Activists emphasized that the legislation's focus on women's bodies rather than social reform was both unjust and ineffective in curbing disease transmission. The campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts gained broad support from diverse segments of society, including religious groups, working-class women, and progressive politicians. Public meetings, pamphlets, and petitions pressured Parliament to reconsider the laws. The movement exposed the hypocrisy of a society that preached morality, yet sanctioned systematic violation of women's rights under the pretense of public health. Eventually, due to mounting pressure and growing recognition of the law's harmful effects, the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed in 1886. However, the impact of these laws persisted well beyond their formal end. The acts left a lasting legacy of distrust between women and medical authorities and deepened societal surveillance of female behavior. They also served as a catalyst for the emerging feminist movement, fueling debates about bodily autonomy, gender equality, and legal reform. The policing of women's bodies during this period reveals the Victorian obsession with regulating sexuality through control and punishment, rather than compassion and understanding. The Contagious Diseases Acts were less about public health and more about maintaining a rigid social order that restricted women's freedom under the guise of protection. The invasive examinations and arbitrary arrests reflected the broader societal impulse to define and discipline femininity, linking morality closely to physical purity. Beyond the immediate consequences for individual women, these laws highlight the intersection of class, gender, and power in Victorian England. The burden of surveillance and punishment fell disproportionately on poor women, whose poverty rendered them vulnerable to both exploitation and legal persecution. Middle and upper-class women, protected by social privilege, rarely faced such scrutiny. This class bias intensified existing inequalities and underscored the ways law and medicine were used to uphold social hierarchies. The Contagious Diseases Acts also foreshadowed later debates about consent, medical ethics, and women's rights. The lack of informed consent during medical examinations was a violation of personal autonomy that resonates with ongoing discussions about bodily integrity today. The campaigns against these acts helped lay the groundwork for future advances in women's legal protections and healthcare rights. Ultimately, the story of the Contagious Diseases Acts is a powerful example of how fear and prejudice can lead to oppressive laws disguised as public welfare. The acts reveal a Victorian society struggling to contain sexuality within strict bounds, resorting to invasive and discriminatory measures that harmed the very women they purported to protect. The fierce opposition they provoked shows that even in an era of repression, voices calling for justice and dignity refused to be silenced. What secret punishments awaited those who dared to love outside society's rules? Come with us to know. The criminalization of love between men. In an era governed by strict social codes and rigid moral expectations, love between men was not only condemned but treated as a criminal offence. The Victorian legal system imposed harsh punishments on those who dared to express affection or engage in relationships that fell outside society's narrow definitions of acceptable love. This climate of fear forced countless men to live in secrecy, suppressing their true feelings and desires to avoid public shame, imprisonment, or worse. The criminalization of male same-sex love exposed a society deeply intolerant of difference, one that wielded law and social stigma as tools to enforce conformity. The legal framework against homosexuality was unyielding. The Offences Against the Person Act of 1861 initially criminalized certain homosexual acts, but it was the Labouchere Amendment of 1885 that broadened the scope dramatically by making gross indecency between men a punishable offence, even if no physical acts were proven. This vague phrasing allowed for a wide range of prosecutions based on suspicion, rumour, or private evidence, giving authorities sweeping power to target men suspected of homosexuality. Unlike heterosexual relations, which were largely tolerated as private matters, male same-sex love was prosecuted openly and harshly. Convictions often resulted in imprisonment, forced labour, and the complete destruction of the individual's social standing. One of the most notorious examples of the cruelty of these laws was the trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895. Wilde, a celebrated playwright, poet, and one of the most brilliant literary minds of the age, was publicly tried and convicted for gross indecency due to his relationships with younger men. The scandal captivated Victorian society, turning the spotlight onto the brutal repression faced by gay men. Wilde's trial was not merely a legal event. It was a public spectacle that exposed the harsh realities of prejudice and injustice. His sentence of 2 years' hard labour devastated his health and career, leading to his premature death. Wilde's story remains an enduring symbol of Victorian intolerance and the tragic consequences of living under such oppressive laws. But Wilde's experience was far from unique. Beyond the glare of public attention, many men lived in constant terror of discovery. Homosexuality was shrouded in secrecy and fear, forcing gay men to hide their identities or face legal and social annihilation. They developed coded languages and secret signals to communicate discreetly, relying on underground networks and clandestine meeting places to find companionship and support. The constant threat of blackmail or arrest led to widespread psychological trauma and social isolation. The criminalization of love between men was also a reflection of deeper anxieties about gender, power, and social order. Victorian society prized strict gender roles and a rigid binary understanding of sexuality. Male same-sex relationships challenged the ideal of masculinity and the central institution of the family, which was considered the foundation of social stability. Men who engaged in homosexual acts were demonized as deviants who threatened the fabric of society, challenging norms that demanded men be stoic, dominant, and heterosexually inclined. Medical and scientific authorities of the period further entrenched these prejudices by pathologizing homosexuality. It was frequently labeled a mental disorder, a moral failing, or a symptom of degeneration. These medicalized views justified harsh treatments ranging from forced confinement to painful and degrading cures. The idea that homosexuality was a disease reinforced social stigma and legal persecution, compounding the marginalization of gay men. Instead of compassion or understanding, they were subjected to suspicion, abuse, and institutional violence. Despite these dangers, a resilient underground culture flourished in Victorian England. Literature, art, and private salons provided safe spaces where gay men could express themselves and build community. Writers such as Wilde himself, along with others, coded their works with references to same-sex love, creating a discreet but vibrant cultural dialogue. These hidden networks were critical in preserving identity and dignity, laying important groundwork for the future movements that would fight for LGBTQ+ rights and recognition. The widespread persecution and public humiliation endured by Victorian gay men left long-lasting scars. The oppressive laws and cultural attitudes shaped societal views on homosexuality for generations, creating barriers to acceptance and equality that persisted well into the 20th century. Only decades later did significant legal reforms begin to dismantle these unjust frameworks, but the legacy of criminalization and fear continues to influence many societies around the world. What strange expectations ruled the bedroom behind closed doors? Let us tell you, the rule of simultaneous satisfaction. Behind the elegant facades of Victorian homes and the strict codes of public conduct, an unusual expectation shaped the most private moments of married couples. Victorian society believed that true marital intimacy was not complete unless both husband and wife experienced pleasure simultaneously. This ideal of a perfectly timed climax, known as the rule of simultaneous satisfaction, was seen as the hallmark of a successful marriage and a reflection of moral and physical harmony. The emphasis on simultaneous pleasure was rooted in a complex mix of medical theories, social expectations, and moral beliefs. Victorian doctors and sexologists wrote extensively about the importance of balanced sexual enjoyment for maintaining marital stability. They warned that if one partner failed to achieve climax at the same moment as the other, it could lead to dissatisfaction, emotional distance, and even infidelity. Despite the era's prudish reputation, there was a surprisingly detailed interest in sexual technique and timing within marriage manuals and advice literature. These guides offered instructions on how couples could synchronize their enjoyment, sometimes prescribing precise positions, rhythms, and mental focus. The goal was to create a shared moment of ecstasy that reinforced the bond between husband and wife. However, the pressure to conform to this ideal often led to stress and confusion. Many women entered marriage without proper sexual education, ignorant of their own bodies and needs. Achieving orgasm was less commonly understood or prioritized for women, and the concept of female sexual pleasure was often dismissed or stigmatized. This imbalance made the pursuit of simultaneous satisfaction a difficult, sometimes impossible standard. Men, meanwhile, were expected to control their own pleasure to ensure it coincided with their wives. The idea that a husband might climax too quickly or fail to engage emotionally was seen as a personal failing. This placed immense pressure on men to perform perfectly, adding another layer of complexity to Victorian marital sex. Interestingly, some Victorian sexologists argued that simultaneous orgasm was a sign of moral virtue and emotional connection, rather than mere physical release. The synchronized climax was seen as a sacred moment where mind, body, and soul united, reflecting the ideals of marital harmony promoted by the church and society. Despite the lofty ideals, reality often fell short. Many couples struggled with the expectation, resulting in feelings of inadequacy, frustration, and secrecy. The silence surrounding sexual difficulties meant that problems went unaddressed, and myths about timing and pleasure were perpetuated. Some women faked orgasms to fulfill social expectations, while men concealed their anxieties. The rule of simultaneous satisfaction also influenced Victorian sexual etiquette beyond the bedroom. It reinforced the idea that marriage was a partnership based on mutual respect and shared pleasure, at least in theory. This contrasted sharply with the common notion that women's sexual experiences were secondary or purely reproductive. Modern research shows that simultaneous orgasm is actually quite rare, even today, highlighting how Victorian expectations were more aspirational than realistic. Yet the cultural importance placed on this ideal shaped generations of marital relationships and conversations about intimacy. Victorian beliefs about perfect timing continue to echo in contemporary discussions about sex and relationships. The legacy of these expectations reminds us how deeply cultural norms influence personal experiences and perceptions of pleasure. What secrets lay behind the silence of sexual ignorance? Come with us as we reveal how Victorian women were left in the dark about their own bodies, educating the innocent, but only the boys. Victorian society was obsessed with protecting innocence, yet this protection was glaringly selective. When it came to sexual education, boys and girls were treated very differently, with boys receiving instruction while girls were left in almost complete ignorance. This stark disparity shaped generations of women who entered marriage unprepared and unaware of their own bodies, fueling myths, anxieties, and silence around female sexuality. From a young age, boys were given some rudimentary education about their bodies and sexual function, often framed within moralistic lessons emphasizing self-control and responsibility. Fathers or schoolmasters might provide guidance on puberty, masturbation, and the dangers of immoral behavior. Boys were warned against falling into sin, but they were also equipped with enough knowledge to navigate their transition into adulthood with some understanding. Girls, on the other hand, were shielded from nearly all information about sex. The prevailing belief held that ignorance was their safeguard, preserving purity and preventing temptation. Discussing the female body or sexual matters with young girls was considered improper and even dangerous, potentially corrupting their innocence. Mothers often remained silent, and schools rarely provided any form of sex education for girls. This omission left girls mystified about menstruation, reproduction, and even basic anatomy. The result was a profound gap in understanding that lasted well into adulthood. Many women entered marriage with little idea of what sex entailed, what pleasure meant, or how their bodies worked. This lack of knowledge made them vulnerable to fear, shame, and misconceptions. Medical texts of the time echoed this silence, rarely addressing female sexual health openly or accurately. The double standard extended beyond knowledge to social expectations. While boys were encouraged to be curious and even warned about the dangers of unchecked desire, girls were expected to be modest and chaste, with any sexual feelings denied or repressed. Female sexuality was seen as something to be controlled or subdued, rather than understood or embraced. This disparity had lasting consequences in married life. Women's ignorance about their bodies contributed to the challenges in achieving mutual sexual satisfaction, feeding into myths like the need for simultaneous orgasm. It also reinforced the idea that women's primary role in sex was reproductive, not pleasurable. Husbands were often the sole sources of sexual knowledge, perpetuating an uneven dynamic. Moreover, the silence around female sexuality made it difficult for women to seek help when facing problems like pain, lack of desire, or reproductive health issues. Many suffered in silence, unaware that their experiences were common or treatable. The stigma surrounding these topics meant that doctors were rarely consulted, and when they were, treatments were often rudimentary or harmful. Despite these challenges, some women quietly resisted the ignorance imposed upon them. A small number sought out forbidden books or medical texts, gradually building their own understanding. These efforts laid early groundwork for future movements advocating sexual education and women's health rights. The educational gap also mirrored wider social inequalities. Working-class girls often received even less information, caught in a cycle of poverty and ignorance. For middle and upper-class women, the veneer of propriety masked a deep lack of awareness and communication within families. The Victorian failure to educate girls about sex was a deliberate choice rooted in fear and control. It reflected anxieties about female desire, the threat it posed to social order, and the need to maintain male authority over women's bodies. This legacy of silence and misinformation would take decades to dismantle. Understanding this uneven education reveals how Victorian society shaped gender roles and sexual norms in profound ways. It also highlights the importance of knowledge as a form of empowerment and the damage caused by its denial. Were you shocked by the most horrifying sex practices of the Victorian era? Which fact surprised or disturbed you the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.